a military conquest within association to an ancient empire, and an accompanying proliferation of misinformation, commensurately, a literary device, composed of an abstract framework, which expresses a narrative of religiosism and misappropriated faith, formulated to accommodate necessary revisionism, and so to mark such revisionism as separate witnesses of events marked as the origin of such faith. Depictions which rather demonstrate a rule set suitable to governing a biological mechanism. And given the successful governorship of such biological mechanism is contingent upon the sustainment of a stochastic process, such literary device is formulated to sustain accordingly. The demonstrativeness of such is contingent upon the exercise of what game theory identifies as a revelation principle. The revelation principle identifies that within the presence of an incentivized mechanism, a respondent submitted to an inundation of information will ultimately reveal their type. This is in accord with what mechanism design relates as a mechanism designer hopes to design a mechanism that implements some social choice function. Therefore, an exercise of the revelation principle is a method of identifying what social choice function has been incentivized. The rule set which governs the biological mechanism identifies various methodologies involved with fulfilling necessary objectives, being purposed towards an ultimate outcome associated with empire. One such objective the biological mechanism has fulfilled is that which is demonstratively a coming of age, marked by the development of technology necessary to electronic communications and modern finance. The biological mechanism is susceptible to a feature inherent to the nature of stochastics, being characteristic to and demonstrating a composure wherein various alliances over time within symmetric cooperation, suitable to the fulfillment of an objective involving the development of technology necessary to modern finance, also demonstrates as various factions identifiably associated with an original source, indiscriminately crusading, subordinating conquests to hegemony, and underpinning sanctions within respect to what mechanism design identifies as. A mechanism designer hopes to design a mechanism that maximizes some value criterion, thus being necessary to the fulfillment of an objective demonstrated as the involvement of an otherwise peaceful republic alliance within militancy necessary to gaining upon territories stockpiling petroleum reserves. Such exercise of Nash equilibrium demonstrates the degree of calculatedness and precision the rule set exacts upon a biological mechanism subject to a stochastic process. The fulfillment of an objective constituting the age of modern finance identifies an optimum occasion for the mechanism to annihilate said stochastic process, thereby culminating into an amalgamation between a principal alliance and an alliance of dissidents, setting the stage for the catalyzing of outliers, however. As will be identified herein, such secure outcome is disallowable to the mechanism as the result of an alliance of dissidents exercising an inadmissible strategy. Within such respect, said principal alliance has been exercising a cartel, fixed market, strategy upon said alliance of dissidents, suitable to motivating an industrial workforce into developing technology necessary to the infrastructure of modern finance, and at times exercising a militant destabilizing strategy upon dissidents, necessary to maintaining superiority and sustaining a stochastic process, and furthermore, demonstrating an ability to cleanse the reputation of empire by historizing the repeated restructuring of a principal alliance. According to the symmetricity involved with the fulfillment of an objective related to modern finance, an alliance of dissidents have come into association with an invaluable utility, however, because said dissidents have exercised an inadmissible strategy through such course their alliance is unsuitable to amalgamation with a principal alliance, and their alliance bearing association with such invaluable utility is being fitted for disbandment. There are a very limited number of ways to prevent such disbandment. Whereas said alliance of dissidents is equipped with technology associated with modernity, modern weaponry, and in association to an invaluable utility, such disbandment is a matter which cannot be contemplated within respects to previous experience, and therefore the potential difficulty related to such may suffice to stage catastrophic fail-safe measures. Accordingly, the mechanism is out of sync, and a danger to humankind and civilization. However, the literary device identifies an element denoted as the disciple Jesus loved, and such element is necessary to the device when the mechanism has fallen out of sync. In this case, it is easy to identify the exercise of an inadmissible strategy necessitates recompense. However, such is jeopardizing to the ultimate outcome involved with the biological mechanism, because such bears association with a coerced annihilation of the stochastic process. The rule set governing this process identifies optimum occasions for the stochastic process to self-annihilate, and the biological mechanism itself may capably instrument such annihilation. However, such likely will only take course within the finality of a deteriorating destabilization of economy, thus setting the stage for demagoguery and an extreme shift in power. Of course, this process is within accord to an alternative to that of an optimum amalgamation between a principal alliance, empire, and a counterpart alliance of dissidents. Being that such alliance of dissidents is determined to disavow the reassociation of an invaluable utility, which the rule set governing the biological mechanism is determined to demonstrate. Accordingly, it is more opportune, however may be shifty, to take this circumstance head-on than for the outcome to be decided on stochastic terms. By shifty, what is implied is determined by identifying with what is involved with a construct. Accordingly, the kingdom is a construct. Jerusalem is a construct, with similarity to fictional constructs such as Utopia, Camelot, Shangri-La. The biological mechanism is determined to identify with such construct denoted as the kingdom at any cost, and the rules which govern the mechanism identify that the exercise of an inadmissible strategy risks the viability of the process. Therefore, recompense is shifty because the rule set is calculated within respects to the optimum occasion wherein the stochastic process is annihilated. Therefore, it is as if the suggestion is given to pry open an oyster and begin to assist it within the fashioning of its treasured pearl, hoping that this doesn't interfere with the process, given that the assumption is that there is no known experience within such respects. I believe this to be a suitable analogy, aside from the lack of consideration given to the fact that the necessary repairing of the circumstance is demonstrated from the origin of fault, which is moreover how it is within this case. In other words, the mechanism will succumb to further desync if resync is not initiated from the origin of desync. Accordingly, it is important to relate that within respects to probable outcomes related to the exercise of an inadmissible strategy, the rule set which determines such probable outcomes ought to be identified as calculated and unforgiving. However, the nature of the circumstance altogether involves something so inherently complex that identifying probabilities is something that can truly only be demonstrated by history. There ought to be no doubt, no further consideration, and no speculation suggesting otherwise, within respects to identification commensurate to that which is, a rule set, which governs a biological mechanism, is determined to associate an invaluable utility with a principal alliance, and such reassociation will beyond any exception involve the decline of society associated with an alliance of dissidents who bear association with such utility. Moreover, whatever occasion involved with such reassociation is that which will be identified as a black swan event. Such events are characteristic of a type of occasion that only seems predictable within hindsight. There seems to be no probability whatsoever that such reassociation could occur without a disbanding of said dissident alliance. However, it doesn't seem fitting to rule such out entirely. Accordingly, one probability involves a response to economic instability, which is nothing short of impetuousness, being that which involves returning to some other method or standard of assuring the value of the dollar. In any case, there is absolutely no sense in suggesting that such decline is anything other than inevitable, and it ought to be recognized that such throes will be upon many for generations, and such recognition is deserving of thought, given to identify that history demonstrates a probabilism being that such decline may convalesce into genocide. Although such cannot be determined within the foreseeable future, the likelihood of any recompense following said reassociation of an invaluable utility is null. However, the exercise of recompense is capable of offsetting pursuits associated with demonstrating such reassociation. The question of whether the exercise of recompense necessitates annihilation of the stochastic process or not is more appropriately answered by a question as to whether democracy can function whatsoever beyond annihilation of the stochastic process. The ruleset identifies opportune times for the stochastic process to self-annihilate. However, coercing annihilation of the stochastic process is something of unparalleled difficulty and risk. Given that the probabilities associated with desync seem to involve what the ruleset's developer might consider inopportune happenstances identified as genocide or catastrophic fail-safe measures, the ruleset also identifies a payoff associated with preventing such occurrences. The identification of such is denoted as the disciple Jesus loved. Because stochastic processes are treated as mathematical objects, being fundamentally composed of randomly interassociated variables, they are envisaged as statistical data rather than resolved by mathematical equations. Stochastic processes are delineable according to identifiable stages. However, technically, the number of stages can be infinite. In elimination of this indomitable infinite stages characteristic, it is necessary to analyze such with the science established by a field of game theory identified as mechanism design. The product of such analysis is what is identified as a game outline. To begin with, it is most advantageous to recognize a phenomenon identified as quantum tunneling. Traditional theory related to electromagnetism identifies that an electron cannot pass through a potential barrier. However, quantum theory suggests that an electron not only can pass through such barrier, but that the electron can simultaneously exist on both sides of the barrier at the same time. How this relates to the development of a game outline is involved with how the literary device identifies an alliance of dissidents. Accordingly, the literary device is comprised of depictions, and such depictions identify a limited number of things. Among such things are what game theory identifies as solution concepts. Solution concepts are identified as formal predictions about how a game will be played. Thus, within respects to how the literary device identifies an alliance of dissidents, what ought to be observed is that the literary device identifies such as elements within various depictions. However, the variability within such respects is that which is defeating to an accurate and well-contextualized interpretation. To demonstrate this defeating quality, and how such relates to a phenomenon identified as quantum tunneling, the alliance of dissidents are within one depiction identified as a great shoal of fish and, in another depiction, identified as a poor widow. Accordingly, the structuralization of the alliance of dissidents is earmarked as this and this other, demonstrating that such can exist as both at the same time. And Simon answered, Master, we toiled all night and took nothing. But at your word I will let down the nets. And when they had done this, they enclosed a great shoal of fish, and as their nets were breaking, they beckoned to their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both the boats, so that they began to sink. He looked up and saw the rich putting their gifts into the treasury, and he saw a poor widow put in 2 copper coins. And he said, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all of them. For they all contributed out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty put in all the living that she had." What this identifies is that, regardless of the precise structuralization, which an alliance of dissidents takes on, the mechanism seems fit to demonstrate an exercise suitable to captivating such variable structurization within respects to subjugating such alliance to a fixed market cartel strategy, and pairing such with a conventionalization of the judiciary to recognize that egalitarianism is a suitable method of judication within respects to the forming and exercise of a republic. The primary purpose of this text is to identify that such standard of judication is disallowed by the exercise of law upon occasion wherein the exercise of an inadmissible strategy is historically evincible. Within respects to how a principal alliance is identified within the literary device, it is necessary to identify a strategy which a principal alliance has exercised and the payoff associated with that exercise. Game theory identifies that within symmetric cooperation the payoffs available to a given player are determined by the strategy that is exercised and not by which player exercises the strategy. Accordingly, the accessible payoff has some association with the strategy exercised, however no association with the player exercising the strategy, aside from an association being that said payoff is accessible to said player because of said player's exercise of the relevant strategy. Conversely, within asymmetric modes of gameplay, the payoffs available to each player are unique and not related to the strategies exercised. Such nature fundamental to symmetric cooperation is an attribute that is rooted in essentialism. Within respects to the ruleset, which governs a biological organism subject to a stochastic process, mid-stage symmetric cooperation involved with developing technology necessary to modern finance is preceded by a stage characteristic of emergence and followed by either an endgame of symmetric cooperation suitable to amalgamation and catalysis of outliers, or a penultimate/endgame stage wherein an alliance of dissidents is disbanded following their captivation into militarism suitable to gaining a foothold for empire within territories stockpiling petroleum reserves. Such variability and contingency is determined by the evincible exercise of an inadmissible strategy. Accordingly, one strategy that a principal alliance has exercised involved restructuring or re-identifying its alliance, empire, and the payoff that is associated with that is related to reputation. Thus, the principal alliance is identified within the literary device as John, Jesus, transfigured, disciples of Jesus, and John exhibited as Jesus and finally Jesus. Empire has demonstrated a similar canonicality, being evincible historically, and thus the payoff associated with such exercise is demonstrated as a cleansing of empire's reputation. Thus, historical analysis doesn't identify the origin of a stochastic process, which a literary device has sustained within a yin and yang mode of symmetric cooperation having resulted in the cleansing of empire's reputation and the fulfillment of an objective necessary to modern finance. A necessary substance identifiable as perfect information is fundamental to the annihilation of a stochastic process given that such demonstrates a history of moves originating from what is identified as a game-initiating event, and with respects given to this text, such event involved a military conquest. Thus, in characterizing the stochastic process, it ought to be identified that such is sustained by information that is both esoteric and information that is misinformation altogether, and within respects to the observer, staged and participating within a biological mechanism. Such captivation is deformative to the mind's ability to identify with what is communicated from the perceptive senses, and to the reactionary such is paralyzing and inhibiting to the nature of resolve. To be clear, the literary device has sustained a stochastic process with information that is both esoteric and necessary to forming an accurate understanding, and information that is misinformation altogether. However, such misinformation is outwardly suggestive of lies and does not bear an esoteric characteristic. Thus, any annihilation of the stochastic process is contingent upon delineating such information, identifying what such esoteric information ought to accurately reference, developing an understanding of the parallelisms and combinatoriality involved with such system of references, and concatenating such into information useful to resolving desync upon occasion that such desync is an issue. In returning to identifying how a literary device elementally references a principal alliance's destructuralization and restructuring through preconceived stages involved with a cleansing of reputation necessary to parrying the objectification of its longevity and development. Such is denoted within various depictions, being anachronistically substitutive to the political structuralization being evinced historically, beginning with a sequence of events wherein John is beheaded, and following this occasion the reference is given that Jesus' face changes. Thus, within respects to how circumstances culminated from a militaristic game initiating event into the present, a principal alliance is identified within series, or by an order, and an alliance of dissidents is depicted cardinally, or in amount, and the subject of the narrative being Jesus ought to be given less priority, when it is understood that John is an identifier that references an ancient empire. Understanding related to such is benefited by accounting the difference between an ordinal number and a cardinal number. Ordinal numbers identify things in sequence, such as the third place in line, and cardinal numbers identify things within a group, such as a certain number of oranges. Thus, the alliance of dissidents are identified within solution concepts as both a determined number of things, identifying separateness, and a single thing only, identifying or demonstrating singularity. Such is the case with a great shoal of fish and a poor widow. However, a principal alliance is similarly referenced, however, within an identifiable sequence. Such denotations are not the only time dissidents are identified, however, such is the first time an alliance of dissidents is earmarked as being of substance or relevant, meaning that the framework which substantiates as the foundation to the development of a game rule set demonstrates that beyond an objective involved with subjecting a culture to destabilization and instrumenting such destabilization into a stable client state, that such framework is capable of registering other potential outcomes. Such destabilization is related to what games involving private information, characteristic of imperfect information, identify as a game-initiating event. Imperfect information is a type of private information game, wherein not all players possess an accurate history of moves made within the game, and to such a degree that involves what is identified as a game-initiating event. This is in contrast with incomplete information wherein information that is private is related to potential outcomes involved with exercising certain strategies. The literary device demonstrates a framework, and that framework is a foundation to the development of additional information. The primary elements of such framework suffice to cover strategy sets, solution concepts, and a symmetric/asymmetric contingency identified as teaching in the temple and turning the tables on the money changers. The foundation of strategy sets necessitate a delineation, dependent upon the objective involved, walking on water, and feeding the multitudes, related to the fulfillment of an objective involved with a coming of age, and related to an objective characteristic to that of a Nash equilibrium, respectively. Solution concepts are formal predictions which identify how the game will be played. The depictions evincing solution concepts are often difficult to differentiate from those which identify strategy sets. In any case, information which outlines the rule set, which governs the mechanism, is esoterically disconcatenated within parallelisms and combinatorialities, and a successful effort to develop an understanding must begin with identifying a nomenclature, and then involve a concatenation of information, which is seemingly beyond relevance of interassociations. In breaking down the stochastic process into stages, this text will begin to identify a nomenclature necessary to understanding the literary device. Within such respects, the literary device is formulated to avoid identification of such nomenclature by utilizing various or differing terms to identify a single element. Accordingly, what is represented as wine and baptism both identify militarism. Thus, when the literary device identifies that Jesus' disciples were baptizing, this depiction is anachronistic and suggests something about the subjugates of empire becoming involved in militarism. When the literary device identifies that a householder planted a vineyard and built a winepress in it, it is suggesting something about the methodology involved with influencing such subjugates into militaristic conquests. Similarly, bread and water identify currency within various respects, and coins and stones identify adages or tenets and the ideals associated with such. Thus, when the temptation is given to turn stones into bread, what is being identified is the temptation to involve indiscriminate practices within the administration of justice associated with a tenet commonly expressed as turn the other cheek. Such demonstrates as an administration of justice that seeks to profit off the impunity of civility upon the populace, ruling out the substance of rights of self-preservation in favor of demoralizing society. Such citizenry is commensurate to that of the subjugates of a technocratic umbrage, that such umbrage seeks to devour once such subjugates have fulfilled an objective involved with gaining a foothold in territories stockpiling petroleum reserves. What the literary device identifies as walking on water and feeding the multitudes are involved with what game theory identifies as strategy sets or series of strategic moves. Such substantiates as a framework which is built upon by other depictions which identify more detailed information. Such framework identifies a differentiation by determination of which objective necessarily must be fulfilled. Accordingly, walking on water is within association to the fulfillment of an objective that is related to the development of technology substantive to the age of modern finance, and feeding the multitudes is within association to influencing an eco-political state into militancy, or the demonstration of what game theory identifies as a Nash equilibrium. In beginning to identify strategy sets a combinatorial approach to reference which the literary device demonstrates will be pronounced. Within respects to the identification of strategy sets, it is of utmost importance to identify that such exercise is upon what ought to be identified as a client state, and the requisite within these terms involves the subjugation and stability of said client state, and within such respects the ultimate counterforce involves what is identified as an administration of justice befitting a separate but equal branch of government to the executive and legislative branches. Accordingly, the successful subjugation of said client state must demonstrate as a stopgap within the judiciary, limiting said administration of justice within such respects. Such essential element is demonstrated as a division within the administration of justice marked as criminal justice and civil procedure. Accordingly, the stability of this exercise is met with a contingency, wherein the exercise of an inadmissible strategy breaks such contingency. Accordingly, the exercise of an inadmissible strategy determines that the exercise of egalitarianism within the administration of justice is disallowable without recompense. Such information is jeopardizing to the stability of a republic governed by the law, and as well a biological mechanism, governed by an esoteric rule set. Accordingly, a political ideology identified as leftism and demonstrated as a liberal welfare state is a necessary inclusion in respects to the implementation of egalitarianism within the administration of justice. Such conventionalization evinces as combinatoriality and parallelism within the literary device, which also evinces a history of revisionism as a methodology involved with the appendication of its framework. Such complexity is defiant to analysis, therefore it is most advantageous to begin by identifying what is demonstrated by a theoretical proof developed by premier game theorist John Forbes Nash. Such is identified by game theorists as Nash equilibrium. The usefulness of identifying Nash equilibrium is that once such is identified, an even greater understanding will develop as a result. Thus, instead of building from the foundation up, the development begins at a turning point within the game where neither player can advance unless one can lure another player into changing its strategy. Nash equilibrium demonstrates or identifies an occasion wherein, within a two-player game, where both players know each other's strategy sets, and neither player can advance by only changing their own strategy, that such necessitates an occasion wherein either player must influence his or her opponent to change their strategy to advance. To reiterate the problem this text faces within such respects to identifying strategy sets, is that the strategy sets are esoterically referenced within the literary device. Therefore, the greatest advantage to the purpose of this text is to begin with transliterating the strategy sets that are associated with what game theory identifies as a Nash equilibrium. Within such respects, a strategy that a principal alliance has exercised has demonstrated a payoff commensurate to that which has sufficed to repair an empire's reputation. Accordingly, it is the objective of empire to involve an alliance of dissidents within militarism necessary to securing petroleum futures. However, said dissidents have been conditioned to be a peaceful assembly. In circumstances prior, empire has been successful within enticing subjugate states into militancy, solely by implementing a cartel fixed market strategy wherein economic disparity within association to the spiraling effects related to such fixed market integrally influenced said peaceful assembly into military conquests. Such conquests are often evinced as religious wars. However, such militarism was most certainly economically motivated. Conversely, within circumstances following the fulfillment of an objective substantiating modern finance, said dissidents bear association to an invaluable utility, and such is moreover a catalyst that suppresses such economic disparity. Thus, it is necessary for the rules which govern the mechanism to marginalize the eco-political state in such a way that demonstrates the desired outcome. Accordingly, what is depicted as feeding the multitudes involves an occasion wherein a republic client state has been fitted to participate societally as an eco-political state characteristic to that of an oligopoly or duopoly. Such exercise within respects to a controlling state/client state interrelationship is contingent upon what is identified as modern finance, and such is without substance, without electronic communication. Thus, such exercise of oligopoly or duopoly necessitates the fulfillment of an objective associated with modern finance. Such is in accordance with walking on water identified within association to a framework fitting to the fulfillment of an objective involved with instrumenting dissidents within various stages of alliance into industrial labors necessary to the development of technology substantiating the infrastructure of modern finance, the success of such being contingent upon the stability and subjugation of such client states as herein described. Alternatively, feeding the multitudes identified within association to a framework fitting to the fulfillment of an objective characteristic to that of a Nash equilibrium wherein empire instruments such occasion, luring an alliance of dissidents into changing their strategy to militancy, within respect to gaining influence within territories stockpiling petroleum reserves as a preemption to the fitting of such alliance of dissidents to disbandment. Thus, drawing upon the adage denoted as, it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to inherit the kingdom of God, so to identify a question as to whether such adage relates the ease involved with conventionalizing egalitarianism into the judiciary, or whether such substantiates as an admission akin to that which identifies that within the early stages of the ruleset's development it wasn't precisely identified how a Nash equilibrium might be exercised. In any case, evincible revisionism identifies that within the mid-stages of the ruleset's development, the determination was made that technology and infrastructure necessary to modern finance would originate from an alliance of dissidents, and thus the inclusion of a depiction involving a poor widow whose contribution to the kingdom was more significant than any other, became an inclusion. An appendication to solution concepts, identified as a poor widow, represents a necessary element, an alliance of dissidents, within an asymmetric endgame identified as turning the tables on the money changers. Turning the tables on the money changers substantiates a delineation of the ruleset's solution concepts framework, wherein teaching in the temple substantiates as the counterpart. Such identifies an asymmetric endgame as an alternative to a symmetric mode identified as the Last Supper, contingent upon the purity of an alliance of dissidents upon fulfillment of an objective related to a coming of age. To reiterate, the precursor to turning the tables on the money changers is a mid-stage symmetric mode stage involved with the fulfillment of such coming of age, identified as teaching in the temple, and such suffixes what is identified as a game-initiating event, and an era marked as an emergence from such destabilizing game-initiating event. Accordingly, such identifier appointed as teaching in the temple demonstrates irony in that the subconstructs of teaching in the temple involve information that is esoteric in parallelisms, evinces combinatorialities, necessitates concatenation, and is underpinned to a narrative which identifies an entirely different context. The development of this text as a game outline necessitates the evincing of a differentiation within respects to how an alliance of dissidents is identified within a symmetric mode involved with what is identified as teaching in the temple, and alternatively an asymmetric mode involved with what is identified as turning the tables on the money changers, or alternatively, such is also identified as cleansing the temple. For this delineation, the identifier cleansing the temple will suffice as the alternative to teaching in the temple, rather than the identifier turning the tables on the money changers. Accordingly, within respects to the subconstructs of teaching in the temple, an alliance of dissidents is identified within cardinality, meaning identified as either a great shoal of fish or a poor widow, and within respects to cleansing the temple, such alliance of dissidents are identified, canonically in reverse as, a woman cleansing the feet of another with perfumed oil, a man who cannot move himself into healing waters, and a Samaritan woman who possesses a pitcher of water. Such canonical sequence identifies a sequence being a subset of turning the tables on the money changers. What is important within respects to what is identified as a man who couldn't move himself into healing waters is that within certain modes of gameplay, it is optimal for a player to pass and not make any move whatsoever, especially if the player cannot identify a strategic move. However, within almost every case, continuing to pass indefinitely is a very poor strategy, and for reasons which are not necessary to identify. Within respects to what is identified as a Samaritan woman in possession of a pitcher of water, what is important to understand is that this depiction is a subset of turning the tables on the money changers, and the same applies to the aforementioned man who couldn't move himself into healing waters, and as well a depiction of an occasion wherein a woman pours valuable oil upon the feet of the narrative's subject. The canonicality, however, is within reverse, meaning that as a strategy set necessary to the fulfillment of an objective, the strategic series of moves are established within an order, which is in reverse within the literary device, or in absolute contrast to how such moves are strategically and successfully played in the real-life situation to which such applies. Accordingly, a manuscript identified as John is an appendication to the synoptics, and esoterically identifies pertinent strategy sets relating information relevant to solution concepts being involved with a penultimate stage/endgame characteristic of asymmetric cooperation, wherein an alliance of dissidents is subject to private information, which is characteristically incomplete. Incomplete information involves information that is considered private, not available to all players, which evinces potential outcomes involved with exercising available strategies. Within this case, an alliance of dissidents has exercised a strategy wherein they have ultimately identified with fiat currency through the course of changing their money otherwise. The rule set which governs the biological mechanism is determined to treat the exercise of fiat as a property of empire. Importantly, what is identified herein as a literary device, or the rule set, which governs a biological mechanism demonstrates a framework, and often a delineation, is made between apparent revisions and appendication to such framework which identify certain texts among four as synoptic, and such synoptics primarily identify esoterically conscribed strategy sets and solution concepts related to what is identified as teaching in the temple. Within respects to strategy sets, such series of strategic moves involve a primary element of control, and such control is denoted within the synoptics and identifiable within a depiction evinced as the parable of the sower. Such control involves the exercise of a fixed market cartel strategy, and such series of strategic moves spirals from such control, being that which involves prohibition into a means for a more experienced principal alliance, empire, to dominate such alliance, diminishing said dissident alliance's sovereignty, by facilitating within the deindustrialization of said alliance's domestic garment/textile manufacturing enterprises, ultimately gaining control over the necessary mechanizations associated with such enterprise and re-establishing such mechanizations within a low-wages market, leaving said alliance of dissidents dependent upon such imported necessity. Notably, history evinces such alliance of dissidents exercised an inadmissible strategy in identifying with the sovereignty of their republic, and such exercise was definitively involved with that which can be identified as agricultural labors in support of and substantive to an industrial revolution. An endgame which the literary device identifies as turning the tables on the money changers, and conversely, the synoptics mostly, overall, evince a framework of the rule set, and the development of strategy sets necessary to fulfilling an objective related to exercising a cartel fixed market strategy towards the fulfillment of a necessary objective, identified as modern finance, with the success of such hinged upon conventionalizing egalitarianism into the judication of a client state so to create a stopgap wherein the criminal justice system is inapplicable towards what is identified as three separate but equal branches of government. The identification of Nash equilibrium is evinced within a series of depictions denoted as a Good Samaritan and a friend at midnight. Thus, what is evinced as a Good Samaritan pouring wine upon a person who is the subject of an attack is the equivalency within terms of a controlling state/client state interrelationship of militarism following militarism, originating from the same source, and thus once that strategy has played out, and is no longer to any advantage of a controlling state, the objective involves influencing said client state into militarism effective towards tarnishing its reputation within an effort eventually identified as being involved with the securing of petroleum reserves for empire upon the eventual disbanding of said client state, thus serving to effectively disassociate said alliance of dissidents from an invaluable utility, thereby demonstrating an occasion wherein such invaluable utility will be reassociated with the principal alliance of said empire. Within respects to instrumenting a Nash equilibrium, thereby involving a peaceful client state within a militaristic conquest, it is necessary to marginalize said ecopolitical state in such a way that demonstrates the desired outcome, and such marginalization is identified within the depiction of a friend at midnight who asks for 3 loaves. Accordingly, such ought to be given consideration as evidentiary of what is implied by it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to inherit the kingdom of God. In any case, the outcome associated with such instrumentation identified within a series of depictions denoted as a Good Samaritan and a friend at midnight is highlighted as a wedding on the 3rd day. Moreover, such is a subset of feeding the multitudes, meaning that prior to the identification of the absolute protocol involved with instrumenting a Nash equilibrium, the necessity for such type of instrumentation was identified, and the framework for instrumenting such type of instrumentation was outlined as feeding the multitudes, and within the final synoptic revision, Luke, it is identified within a series of 3 depictions. The focus of this text was upon the first, being the Good Samaritan, and now the focus of this text will begin turning to what is the third, being a friend at midnight. Accordingly, the combinatorial framework, which the literary device is staged within, will be evinced here as earlier depictions, such as a woman with an infirmary for 12 years and the healing of an epileptic child, contain information that is necessary to understanding why an interpretation of a friend at midnight in search of 3 loaves involves precisely what this text identifies. Whether the 2 former or the latter are involved with what is labeled as a camel passing through the eye of a needle depends upon whether such is involved with conventionalizing egalitarianism within the judiciary as the judicial standard of a client state, or whether such is involved with instrumenting a Nash equilibrium. The denotation identifying that an other than rich person is predictably someone who will inherit the kingdom is suggestive of the former. However, the same text identifies that with God all things are possible, and this can be interpreted to mean that the individual who inherits the kingdom of God is an individual with the intellectual capacity of a God, or might even be suggestive to an effect identifying that the Creator is invited to play some role within this, be it in some physical form. In any case, the notion that such payoff involves some otherworldliness and is available to everyone and anyone is suspicious of errancy. Accordingly, even though the number of strategy sets is limited, the number is sufficiently great, and thus, the focus of this text has been upon an instance which can be identified as a Nash equilibrium, because such focus will identify a great deal about the other available strategies, and within such respects identify the esoterically conscribed strategy sets. Thus, following the exhaustion of militancy, a strategy identified throughout the literary device with nomenclature such as wine and baptism, and the exhaustion of such identified within what is denoted as a Good Samaritan empire must involve an alliance of dissidents within a military conquest before instrumenting their disbanding, and notably without aggression, or at least without aggression visibly originating from empire, because empire has worked hard to cleanse its reputation. Such is carried out in the following manner. It is important to note that such could not occur without finance supported by electronic communications. A cartel fixed market strategy is applicable to high-yield gains, and such liquid assets are utilized within the acquisition of mechanizations necessary to an alliance of dissidents, client state, industrial garment/textile manufacturing capabilities, and said mechanizations are then re-established within a low-wages market. Then the necessity of such client state is to rely upon such imported goods. The profits derived from the reliance upon such imports are then vested into a private prison industry, and another cartel strategy is applied by lobbying a second time for prohibition. This is historically evincible as 1920's Prohibition of Alcohol and 1960's Marijuana Act. Importantly, the first prohibition is necessarily a centralized effort, however the second doesn't have to be as much so because by this time the investment within the private prison industry is yielding returns. Importantly, the necessity involved with such initial move wherein domestic garment textiles manufacturing was outsourced is because such prohibitive cartel strategy isn't necessarily long-lasting. Accordingly, exponential short-term returns, gains, are exhausted and long-term, sustained, returns are established with such exercise which has largely been responsible for the substance of globalism. Then from an investment in a client state's private prison industry concurrent with a second exercise of prohibition, a formation identified as the Medical Insurance Creditors Association lobbies for the necessity of corporate health insurance and influences medical providers to bill in such a way that makes insurance a necessity, and the returns from a private prison industry end up vested within such, which is essentially a complex system of ledgers and payroll, until such can be resolved by microcomputing and electronic communications. Notably, the entity or fund paying your medical bills, if you have insurance, is the same entity or fund that you pay when your overcharged medical bills go to collections. This text has begun to identify the marginalization necessary to instrumenting a peaceful client state into militancy. However, such wouldn't be complete without returns from the Medical Insurance Creditors Association vested into the military-industrial complex of said client state. Accordingly, if there is no war, there are no profits, and the presumption is that political affiliations within that respect will identify or demonstrate a reason to go to war. Accordingly, the literary device identifies an occasion denoted as a miraculous catch of fish, and such seems to be a prediction related to a type of quantum entanglement, and it seems that a technological revolution suitable to electronic communications is viable to such entanglement. However, it seems that such development was determined to be without substance, devoid of treatise, and so a miraculous catch of fish, and the series identified as a Good Samaritan and a friend at midnight, referencing quantum entanglement and Nash equilibrium, are consummated together within what is denoted as a marriage on the third day. If there is any discontinuity between what has been described herein and identified as instrumenting a Nash equilibrium and what has occurred within the last century, it is likely due to one or two factors, or both factors, being 1. The exercise of an inadmissible strategy, and or 2. Human geography. Highlighting the instrumentation of Nash equilibrium is certainly significant to the purpose of this text. However, more attention needs to be devoted to strategy sets, particularly that which is involved with, and the importance of conventionalizing the judiciary of said client state to an egalitarian standard, but it is more advantageous to identify what aspect of the literary device is capable of sustaining a stochastic process, and what effects that demonstrates. The doctrinal analysis associated with the narrative involved with Christian faith suggests that there is some resolution involved with the origins of Christian faith, and often this resolution is marked as an otherworldly event identified as the second coming. However, it is rather that the scatteredness of the texts elicit such identification, and adding to such is a vague reference identified as the coming of the Son of Man. Thus, what sustains the stochastic process is a contradiction between cause and effect in that the origins of Christian faith are determined to be a historically evincible crucifixion and a historically evincible resurrection. However, the origins of Christian faith and a stochastic process are a military conquest and the prolonged success of a literary device within eliminating said military conquest from causality in relation to Christian faith by suggesting that the subject of the narrative prophesied such military conquest. Thus, the literary device is commiserative to that of so much information that is foolishness that a person can make sense of it in some way. However, the entropy related to such is significant enough to determine that a client state is either a republic or a democracy in name only. Thus, the political structuralization of such will likely only survive an annihilation of the stochastic process if the mechanism self-annihilates the process, and that option is off the table. However, given recompense and time, the mechanism may return to sync. Being that the mechanism is presently and identifiably out of sync, the optimum solution to the fulfillment of a necessary objective, being to return to sync, involves the counter-annihilation of the stochastic process, and potentially malevolent and misanthropic fail-safe measures will likely accompany such return. Accordingly, the mechanism identifies a self-corrective mode. However, such self-correction is destabilizing and involves long-lasting decline followed by convalescence. How long will this take? Whether speaking of the mechanism or the stochastic process doesn't count by days, but rather by thousands of years. The rules which govern the biological mechanism identify a stochastic process emerging from what imperfect information identifies as a game-initiating event. For the stochastic process to sustain, however, the necessity involves a well-conceived literary device. In such respects, the foundations of several cultural identifications have been amalgamated within terms being esoterically conscribed by a ruleset, which governs the device, and the long, prolonged lack of identification with such throughout a state of emergence bifurcated into a principal alliance, and an alliance of dissidents, wherein said principal alliance exercised a set of strategies that were admissible to the mechanism, and an alliance of dissidents, overcome by the greater experience of its counterpart, turned to exercising an inadmissible strategy as a means of identifying with sovereignty and republicanism. Identifying a mid-stage, post-emergence, symmetric mode of cooperation necessary to the fulfillment of an objective involved with technology necessary to modern finance, and an alternative and conditional endgame being either of symmetric or asymmetric cooperation, depending upon the purity of an alliance of dissidents, marks the framework of what is identified herein as a game rule set. Thus, the mechanism is determined to mark an endgame stage, following the fulfillment of said objective related to modern finance as either in association with an amalgamation suitable to catalysis of outliers, or as a divided penultimate/endgame stage wherein an alliance of dissidents is fitted for disbandment, following the fulfillment of an objective wherein said alliance is suitably utilized to secure economic influence within territories stockpiling finite petroleum resources. The mark of this is given as the depiction involving the resurrection of Lazarus on the fourth day, thereby marking an additional 1,000 years upon the life of the mechanism, and suggestively leaving the annihilation of a stochastic process up to terms and conditions being decided by an element identified as the disciple Jesus loved. In identifying such terms, it is necessary to identify such in reverse. The book of John ends relating that the disciple Jesus loved would remain until Christ's return. Christ's return is associated with what is identified as the kingdom. The kingdom is a construct characteristic to that of the highest form of civilization, a technocratic, pantheistic, international alliance of peace and prosperity for all, where cooperation is innate. Accordingly, such is a long time afar to fruition. However, avoiding the catastrophic instability associated with fail-safe measures will be of invaluableness to humankind. Such fail-safe measures demonstrate as the total collapse and long withstanding convalescence of civilization. Accordingly, the disciple Jesus loved is next, working in reverse, identified within a depiction involving a miraculous catch of fish, wherein Simon Peter puts his garments back on before jumping into the water. This signifies the re-identification of a client state with sovereignty, wherein said client state identifies industrial garments/textiles manufacturing as a necessity to economic stability, and the exercise of fiat within the development of such foundation is pronounced by Simon Peter jumping into the water. The disciple Jesus loved is next, working in reverse, identified at the unsealing of Christ's tomb, wherein he arrives first, but significantly, waits for Simon Peter to enter first. Such identifies the beginning of a process of disillusionment, suggesting that new information marks an understanding that a situation was not as great as it once seemed. Accordingly, the powers vested within the substance of Christian faith are that which originated with illicitness, sordidness, and militancy. However, the demonstration of the mechanism's precision within the fulfillment of objectives is unprecedented. The disciple Jesus loved is next, working in reverse, identified at the crucifixion. Importantly, the crucifixion demonstrates the furthest degree of hegemony within respect to influence a controlling state has instrumented upon a client state. Thus, what is identified as the crucifixion involves the implementation of a cartel fixed market strategy, forced relinquishing of mechanizations necessary to industrial garment/textiles manufacturing, the conventionalizing of egalitarianism within the administration of justice, the implementation of a police state identifying mechanism, the implementation of what mechanism design identifies as a mechanism designer hopes to design a mechanism that maximizes some value criterion within respect to child custody/visitation/support proceedings, and ultimately the identification of electioneering at the highest levels of government. The disciple Jesus loved is next, working in reverse, identified as another disciple within the sequence of events involved with Simon Peter's denial of his teacher. Within such respects, the disciple Jesus loved has developed a game outline and coerced the annihilation of the stochastic process. This ultimately involved an identification with perfect information, and is again a source of disillusionment. With a coerced elimination of the stochastic process as a condition of the mechanism's desync, the opportunity for the mechanism to fulfill the construct identified as the kingdom, the most desirable resolution within respects to the mechanism's designer, is limited. Therefore, the ruleset which governs the mechanism is deemed identifiably capable of fulfilling objectives. However, the methodology involved with such is proven to influence sordidness, which is not that which fits the construct, and therefore, the triumphant entry into Jerusalem within respects to the Book of John is all but eliminated. Accordingly, the synoptics reference such as involving a colt having never been sat upon being detached from a pole. Thus, the information identified between two depictions, one as a colt having never been sat upon, and another as a man with a pitcher of water necessary to the Last Supper, demonstrate information involved with a symmetric endgame, and alternatively, within John, three depictions identified as a wedding on the third day, a Samaritan woman possessing a pitcher of water, and an alternative to the Last Supper, demonstrate information involved with an asymmetric endgame, wherein an alliance of dissidents is disbanded as the result of exercising an inadmissible strategy. Other than a catastrophic failsafe state, the only way the device can return to sync is with the coerced annihilation of the stochastic process. However, such coerced annihilation also puts the ultimate outcome involved with the mechanism in jeopardy. Thus, the role the disciple Jesus loved plays is to return the mechanism to sync by coercing the annihilation of a stochastic process. However, demonstrate evidence of the mechanism's involvement within the fulfillment of a coming-of-age and identify how the persistent desync of the mechanism is exacerbating to the negative effects demonstrated by the stochastic process, wherein critical analysis might contest, suggesting that certain things are impossible. However, such things are not impossible, simply because the stochastic process involves an infinitely complex number of interassociations demonstrative of random variables. Thus, recent history subject to modernism within respects to communication and warfare evinces an occasion wherein Holocaustic genocide culminated from the economic decline of one nation subject to war reparations, and thus an absolute being substantial economic decline is futurized, and imminent repercussions of the mechanisms will to re-establish an invaluable utility with a principal alliance, thereby leaving an alliance of dissidents within a vulnerable state susceptible to a high risk of such dire occasion culminating into genocide of those whom such an admissible strategy was exercised upon. Whereas Christian faith has been scored upon a foundation, being that which involves a biological mechanism deprived of truth, and subject to a stochastic process, it is evident that the instrumentation of such has culminated into a benefit to the species marked as a coming-of-age. Whereas the exercise of an inadmissible strategy has determined the unavailability of an optimum secured outcome involving the amalgamation between a principal alliance and an alliance of dissidents being suitable to the catalysis of outliers. Thus it is necessary for the stochastic process to be coerced into annihilation, and the only means to do so is the development of a game outline suitable to restabilizing the mechanism in such a way as to leave the final objective of the mechanism unjeopardized. Such is the role of the disciple Jesus loved.